My name is Sophia Carter, and I'm 24 years old. Tonight, I'm standing in my childhood bedroom for the last time, packing my final belongings while my parents downstairs celebrate my sister's engagement. What they don't know is that I just discovered the $50,000 they're spending on Madison's wedding came from money that was supposed to save my life during my cancer treatments. I'm leaving forever, and the letter I'm about to place on my pillow will make my sister scream those exact words. Before we dive into this story, let me know where you're watching from in the comments below. If you've ever felt like the forgotten child in your family, hit that like button and subscribe for more real-life stories. You won't believe what happens when the truth finally comes out, so let's get started. Growing up with Madison was like living in someone else's shadow permanently. She's 22 now, just 2 years younger than me, but she's always been treated like the sun while I was barely a distant star in my parents' universe. The pattern started early and never stopped. When Madison turned 16, our parents surprised her with a brand new Honda Civic, complete with a giant red bow in the driveway. I remember watching from my bedroom window as she jumped up and down, squealing with joy while Mom and Dad beamed with pride. That same year, when I turned 18 and needed transportation to my part-time job at the grocery store, I was told the family budget couldn't handle another car payment. I walked 4 miles each way, rain or shine, for 2 years. The favoritism wasn't subtle. Madison played volleyball in high school, and our parents attended every single game, tournament, and awards ceremony. They had custom shirts made with her name and number, brought professional cameras, and organized team dinners at our house. When I graduated as valedictorian of my class, they showed up 20 minutes late because Madison had a nail appointment that ran over. They sat in the back, whispering about whether they'd make it to Madison's volleyball practice afterward. I delivered my speech to a sea of proud parents while mine checked their watches. College was where the disparity became truly painful. Madison wanted to attend the state university to study communications, a degree that would cost $40,000 annually. Without hesitation, our parents opened their wallets and paid every penny up front. They bought her a meal plan, dorm furniture, sorority dues, and even a car upgrade since her high school Honda wasn't college appropriate. When my acceptance letter arrived from the pre-med program at a prestigious university, I was told student loans would build character and teach me financial responsibility. I graduated with $80,000 in debt while Madison sailed through 4 years debt-free. Then came my diagnosis. At 19, during my sophomore year, I found a lump in my neck during finals week. The emergency room visit led to a biopsy, which led to the words that changed everything. Hodgkin's lymphoma. I called home from the hospital, my voice shaking as I delivered the news. My mother's first response wasn't concern for my health or fear for my life. It was, "Oh honey, how is Madison going to handle this stress? You know how sensitive she is to family drama." The 6 months of treatment that followed were the loneliest period of my life. Chemotherapy sessions every 2 weeks, radiation treatments, countless blood draws, and the crushing fatigue that made simple tasks feel impossible. I lost 30 pounds, all my hair, and my immune system was so compromised that I couldn't be around crowds. Madison complained constantly about how my illness was affecting her social life. She couldn't bring friends to the house because of my germs, couldn't have parties because I needed rest, and felt embarrassed explaining to her sorority sisters why she couldn't attend certain events. My parents' handling of the medical bills became the family narrative that shaped everything. They spoke in hushed, worried tones about the mounting costs, how insurance wasn't covering enough, how they might need to remortgage the house. I heard phrases like financial ruin and drowning in debt whispered behind closed doors. The guilt was suffocating. Here I was, fighting for my life, and instead of focusing on getting better, I was consumed with shame about being an expensive burden to my family. Meanwhile, Madison's needs never diminished. She still received her monthly allowance, still had her sorority dues paid, still got new clothes and weekend spending money. When I suggested maybe some expenses could be temporarily reduced while we dealt with medical bills, I was accused of being selfish and jealous. "Madison shouldn't have to suffer because you're sick," my father said, as if my cancer was a lifestyle choice I'd made to inconvenience everyone. The recovery period should have been a time of celebration and healing. Instead, it became about Madison's engagement. The moment my oncologist declared me officially in remission, the family focus immediately shifted to Madison's boyfriend Derek and their relationship milestones. My clean bill of health warranted a brief, "That's nice, honey," before the conversation pivoted to whether Derek would propose soon and what kind of ring Madison hoped for. By the time I moved back home after college, the family dynamic was set in stone. Madison was the golden child who deserved everything, and I was the expensive mistake who should be grateful for whatever scraps I received. I accepted this reality because I thought it was temporary, that once I established my career and became independent, the past would fade away. I never imagined that the worst betrayals were still ahead of me. The dinner happened on a Tuesday evening in March, and Madison had been acting strangely all week. She kept checking her phone, applying lip gloss obsessively, and finding excuses to drive past the jewelry store downtown. Derek had been dating her for 3 years, and their relationship had reached that inevitable point where family dinners included subtle pressure about next steps and settling down. What none of us expected was the theatrical production Madison had planned. She arrived at our parents' house dressed like she was attending a movie premiere, wearing a new dress that probably cost more than my monthly grocery budget, and carrying a bottle of champagne that Derek awkwardly held like a prop. Mom immediately sensed something significant was happening and began fussing around the dining room, lighting candles and pulling out the good china that usually only appeared at Christmas and Easter. Derek looked nervous as he helped Madison into her chair, and she kept giggling at nothing, clearly savoring the anticipation she'd created. Dad opened the champagne with ceremonial flourish, and Madison raised her glass with a smile that could have powered the entire neighborhood. "Derek and I have an announcement," she said, pausing for dramatic effect while we all leaned forward. She extended her left hand across the table, revealing a diamond ring so large it looked like it belonged in a museum rather than on someone's finger. The explosion of joy that followed was unlike anything I'd ever witnessed in our household. Mom actually shrieked, a sound I didn't know she was capable of making, while Dad immediately stood up and wrapped Derek in a bear hug, welcoming him to the family with tears in his eyes. Madison basked in the attention like a flower turning toward sunlight, recounting every detail of the proposal, which had apparently happened at a fancy restaurant with hidden photographers and pre-arranged flower deliveries. But it was the conversation that followed dinner that truly opened my eyes to how deep the favoritism ran. While Madison and Mom pored over wedding magazines and Pinterest boards, Dad and Derek discussed practical matters like timeline and budget. I was clearing dishes when I heard Dad mention the $50,000 wedding fund, as casually as he might mention the weather forecast. I nearly dropped the plate I was holding. $50,000. The number echoed in my head as I tried to process what I'd just heard. This was more money than I'd seen in my entire adult life combined. More than my student loan payments for the next 5 years. More than I'd earned in annual salary at any of my jobs. This was life-changing money, and they were discussing it like pocket change reserved for party planning. I couldn't help myself. Standing in the doorway between the kitchen and dining room, I asked the question that had been burning in my throat. Where did that money come from? The table went quiet, and 4 pairs of eyes turned toward me with expressions ranging from surprise to irritation. "What money, honey?" Mom asked, though we all knew exactly what money I meant. "The $50,000 for Madison's wedding." "Where did it come from?" I repeated, trying to keep my voice level despite the growing knot in my stomach. Dad shifted uncomfortably in his chair and glanced at Madison before answering. "We've been saving for years, planning ahead for when one of our daughters got married." His emphasis on the word "one" wasn't lost on me. Madison immediately sensed an opportunity to play victim. Her eyes filled with tears, and her voice took on that wounded tone she'd perfected since childhood. "Are you seriously going to ruin this moment for me, Sophia? Can you just be happy for once instead of making everything about money?" She reached for Derek's hand like she needed protection from my supposedly unreasonable questions. The family immediately rallied to Madison's defense, as they always did. Mom stood up and put protective arms around Madison's shoulders, shooting me a look that could have frozen fire. "Your sister deserves her dream wedding, Sophia. She's always been the responsible one, always made good choices, and worked hard for everything she has. You're being incredibly selfish right now." Derek looked confused by the sudden tension, clearly unaware that he'd stumbled into decades of family dysfunction. Dad jumped in with his usual peacekeeping strategy, which consisted of making me feel guilty for asking reasonable questions. "Madison has earned this celebration, and we're proud to provide it for her. She's been planning her wedding since she was little, and we've been saving specifically for this day." The conversation continued around me as if I'd become invisible again. Madison launched into detailed descriptions of her vision. A destination wedding in Napa Valley, custom invitations, a designer dress, professional photography, flowers flown in from Ecuador, and a reception dinner that would cost more per plate than I spent on food in a month. Every detail was more extravagant than the last, and our parents nodded approvingly at each expensive request. I excused myself and went to my room, but I could hear the celebration continuing downstairs for hours. Phone calls were made to relatives, social media posts were crafted and published, and plans were discussed with the kind of excited energy usually reserved for lottery winnings. As I lay in bed listening to my family celebrate Madison's future, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was fundamentally wrong with this picture. The next few days brought a parade of relatives and family friends coming to congratulate Madison and admire her ring. Each visitor brought gifts, flowers, or contributions to the wedding fund, and the house buzzed with constant activity and excitement. Madison held court in the living room like a princess receiving tribute, graciously accepting praise for her good fortune in finding such a wonderful man and such generous parents. What struck me most was how quickly the extended family aligned against me when I expressed any hesitation about the wedding expenses. Aunt Carol, who had always been my favorite relative, pulled me aside during one gathering and explained that I needed to grow up and stop being jealous of my sister's happiness. Uncle Bob suggested I find a second job if I was so worried about money, since family comes first and Madison's wedding is a once-in-a-lifetime event. The isolation was complete. Every person who should have been in my corner had been turned against me by Madison's skillful manipulation and my parents' unwavering favoritism. I was portrayed as the bitter, jealous sister who couldn't be happy for others, while Madison was the sweet, deserving daughter whose dreams were finally coming true. But the real shock came when I discovered that my parents had refinanced our family home to access the wedding fund money. The house that had been paid off for years, the house that represented their retirement security, was now carrying a new 30-year mortgage just so Madison could have her fairy tale wedding. This wasn't money they'd been saving gradually over time. This was my parents risking their financial future for one day of celebration, while I struggled to afford basic necessities. That night, as Madison called vendors and booked appointments with the urgency of someone planning a military operation, I realized that my family's priorities were so skewed that they were willing to sacrifice decades of financial stability for one perfect day. And somehow, I was the selfish one for questioning it. 3 weeks after Madison's engagement announcement, I couldn't sleep again. The insomnia had become a regular visitor since the wedding planning kicked into high gear, and I found myself wandering around the house at 2 a.m, trying to make sense of the financial contradictions I was witnessing. How could parents who claimed near bankruptcy during my cancer treatments suddenly produce $50,000 for a wedding? The math didn't add up, and the inconsistencies were eating away at my sanity. That night, I ended up in Dad's home office, a small room where he kept important documents and handled family finances. I wasn't snooping intentionally at first, I was just looking for something to read that might help me fall asleep. But when I saw the filing cabinet labeled medical records, curiosity got the better of me. I told myself I just wanted to understand the full scope of what my treatment had cost the family, maybe to find a way to help pay it back now that I was working full-time. What I discovered in that filing cabinet changed everything I thought I knew about my family, my illness, and the last 5 years of financial guilt I'd been carrying. The medical bills were all there, meticulously organized in chronological order, but as I read through them with adult eyes instead of the frightened teenager who had been too sick to pay attention to details, a horrifying picture began to emerge. The insurance coverage had been far better than my parents ever admitted. Blue Cross had covered 80% of my treatments, leaving a remaining balance of approximately $12,000 over the entire 6-month period. This was still a significant amount, but nowhere near the catastrophic financial burden my parents had described. They had made it sound like my cancer was going to bankrupt the family, force them to lose their home, destroy their retirement plans. But the real revelation came when I found the insurance reimbursement statements. Not only had insurance covered most of my treatments, but they had also been sending reimbursement checks directly to my parents for various out-of-pocket expenses, travel costs, and supplemental care provisions. These checks totaled nearly $15,000 over the course of my treatment and recovery period. My hands were shaking as I pulled out my phone and used the calculator app to run the numbers. The insurance had covered 80% of treatments, then reimbursed an additional $15,000 in related expenses. My parents had actually profited from my cancer by approximately $3,000, not counting the money they saved by making me feel too guilty to accept help with basic needs during recovery. I spent the rest of the night calling insurance companies, medical billing departments, and pulling up online account information using passwords I found in Dad's desk drawer. Every piece of information I gathered made the betrayal worse. Not only had my parents lied about the financial impact of my illness, but they had used my guilt and shame to justify years of continued favoritism toward Madison. When morning came, I confronted my mother in the kitchen while she was making coffee and planning her day around wedding errands with Madison. I spread the insurance documents across the kitchen table like evidence in a criminal trial and asked her to explain the discrepancy between what she'd told me and what the paperwork clearly showed. Mom's reaction was immediate and defensive, but not in the way I expected. Instead of denying the evidence or claiming confusion, she broke down completely and admitted everything through tears and desperate justifications. "We needed that money for Madison's future, Sophia. She has so much potential, so many opportunities ahead of her. You were just trying to survive, but Madison could really make something of herself with the right support." The casual cruelty of that statement hit me like a physical blow. In my mother's mind, my life had so little value that profiting from my cancer treatment was justified if it meant giving Madison more advantages. I wasn't a daughter whose health and future mattered. I was an expense to be managed and a resource to be exploited when convenient. Dad arrived in the kitchen during this conversation and, instead of showing shame or remorse when confronted with his deception, he doubled down on the justification with cold calculation that terrified me. "Madison has potential, Sophia. She's going places, she's got leadership qualities, she's the kind of daughter who will take care of us when we're old. You're a survivor, and that's admirable, but survival isn't the same as success. We invested in our future by investing in hers." The conversation continued for 2 brutal hours, during which my parents systematically dismantled every assumption I'd held about our family relationships. They admitted that Madison's college expenses hadn't come from savings they'd accumulated over years of careful budgeting. The money had come directly from my medical insurance reimbursements, combined with a college fund that had originally been split equally between Madison and me. My college fund, the money that should have paid for my education and prevented me from drowning in student loan debt, had been transferred to Madison's account when she turned 18. My parents had forged my signature on documents that required both beneficiaries to agree to fund transfers, stealing my financial future to enhance hers. But the revelation that nearly broke me entirely was learning that Madison had known about this arrangement all along. She wasn't an innocent beneficiary of parental favoritism. She was an active participant in the systematic theft of my opportunities and resources. When she turned 18 and gained access to what she thought was just her college fund, she had questioned why the amount was so much larger than expected. Instead of investigating or insisting on fairness, she had accepted my parents' explanation that I didn't need my fund because I wasn't college material anyway. For 3 years, while I worked multiple jobs and ate ramen noodles to afford textbooks, Madison had been spending money that legally belonged to me on sorority parties, spring break trips, designer clothes, and the kind of college experience I could only dream about. Every time she posted photos of expensive dinners with friends or weekend getaways to beach resorts, she was flaunting my stolen future in my face without a trace of guilt. The medical insurance money had been even easier to hide because I was too sick during treatment to pay attention to financial details. I had trusted my parents to handle the paperwork and billing while I focused on not dying, never imagining they would use my vulnerability as an opportunity to fund Madison's lifestyle upgrades. As I sat in that kitchen, surrounded by evidence of systematic financial abuse and listening to my parents justify stealing from their own daughter during a life-threatening illness, I realized that the family I thought I'd belonged to had never actually existed. These people weren't flawed parents who played favorites. They were calculating manipulators who had spent years psychologically conditioning me to accept exploitation as love. The worst part was understanding that Madison's upcoming wedding wasn't being funded by generous parents sacrificing for their daughter's happiness. It was being funded by money stolen from me during the most vulnerable period of my life, money that had been rightfully mine from the beginning. Every time Madison gushed about her fairy tale wedding and her supportive family, she was celebrating the success of a theft that had been perpetrated against her own sister. That afternoon, I opened my laptop and began documenting everything I'd discovered, taking photos of bank statements, insurance documents, forged signatures, and fund transfer authorizations. I didn't know what I was going to do with the evidence yet, but I knew that the truth needed to be preserved before my family found ways to hide or destroy the proof of what they'd done. For the first time in years, I fell asleep easily that night, not because I felt better about my situation, but because I finally understood the scope of what I was dealing with. The guilt and shame that had been weighing me down weren't mine to carry. They belonged to the people who had created this situation through years of deliberate deception and manipulation. The morning after my devastating conversation with my parents, I expected some kind of family meeting or attempt at reconciliation. Instead, I woke up to find Madison in the kitchen with Mom, surrounded by wedding magazines and vendor brochures, acting as if nothing had happened. When I walked into the room, Madison looked up from her planning materials with a bright smile that didn't reach her eyes and announced, "Sophia, I'm so excited that you're going to be my maid of honor. We have so much planning to do together." The assumption that I would participate in my own exploitation with enthusiasm was breathtaking in its audacity. My parents had positioned this as an opportunity for me to prove my support for Madison and demonstrate that I was mature enough to put family unity ahead of personal grievances. The manipulation was sophisticated, designed to make me look petty and vindictive if I refused, while forcing me to actively contribute to a celebration funded by my stolen money. Over the following weeks, I was dragged to vendor meetings where I watched my parents spend money with the kind of reckless abandon usually reserved for lottery winners. The venue alone cost $18,000 for a single afternoon, more than I'd earned in my entire first year after college. Madison selected it after visiting only 2 options, dismissing the first because the champagne flutes weren't crystal and choosing the second because it had better natural lighting for photos. The wedding dress shopping expedition was particularly humiliating. Madison's appointment was at the most expensive bridal boutique in the state, where dresses started at $3,000 and went up from there. She tried on 12 different gowns, each one more elaborate than the last, while Mom and I sat on plush velvet chairs providing commentary and encouragement. When Madison finally selected her dress, a strapless ball gown with hand-sewn beadwork that cost $4,500, Mom immediately pulled out her credit card without hesitation. When the topic of my maid of honor dress came up, the contrast in treatment was stark and deliberate. Instead of shopping at the bridal boutique or even a department store, I was informed that I would be wearing a dress from my high school formal dance, a navy blue number that I'd worn 6 years earlier and that no longer fit properly. When I pointed out that the dress was outdated and didn't match the wedding's color scheme, Madison pouted that alterations would be too expensive and I should be grateful to have anything suitable at all. The guest list discussions revealed another layer of calculated cruelty. Madison was inviting 300 people to her celebration, including several girls who had bullied me throughout high school and college. When I asked why she felt it was necessary to include people who had made my life miserable, she claimed they were important connections for her future career and social standing. The message was clear. My comfort and dignity were less important than Madison's networking opportunities. The most painful part of the planning process was being expected to fund aspects of the celebration despite being excluded from any actual decision-making. Madison announced that she wanted a bachelorette party weekend in Las Vegas, complete with spa treatments, expensive dinners, and VIP club access. The estimated cost was $3,000 per person for 6 bridesmaids, and as maid of honor, I was expected to organize and partially fund the entire event. When I explained that I couldn't afford such an extravagant celebration, Madison's response was to suggest I take on a second job or ask for advances on my paycheck. The idea that she might scale back her expectations to accommodate my budget never entered the conversation. Instead, family members began pressuring me to step up and do whatever it took to make Madison's dreams come true. Uncle Bob offered to lend me money for the bachelorette party, but only if I signed a formal loan agreement with interest rates that would have taken me years to repay. Aunt Carol suggested I sell my car and use public transportation for a few months to free up funds for Madison's celebration. The extended family had been so thoroughly convinced that Madison deserved unlimited support that they saw nothing wrong with expecting me to go into debt for her entertainment. The vendor meetings became increasingly surreal as Madison's vision expanded beyond even my parents' generous budget. She wanted custom cocktail napkins with her and Derek's monogram embossed in gold leaf. She insisted on flying in flowers from South America because local options weren't exotic enough. She hired a professional photographer whose portfolio included celebrity weddings and who charged more for one day than I made in 6 months. Derek's family meetings were another source of humiliation, as Madison's future in-laws clearly saw me as hired help rather than the bride's sister. Derek's mother would address all questions about logistics and planning to Mom while treating me like I was there to take notes and run errands. When seating charts were discussed, I was placed at the back of the reception hall with distant relatives and family friends, while Madison's sorority sisters got priority seating near the head table. The breaking point approached when I discovered that my parents were considering taking out a second mortgage on their home to fund additional wedding expenses that Madison kept adding to her wish list. The original $50,000 budget had ballooned to nearly $75,000, and instead of asking Madison to make cuts, they were preparing to risk their retirement security to accommodate her expanded vision. But what finally pushed me over the edge was learning about the inheritance manipulation. During a casual conversation about wedding gifts, Dad mentioned that he and Mom were considering signing over their life insurance policies and property deeds to Madison as a wedding present to give her a head start in life and make sure she's provided for if anything happens to us. This wasn't a gift, it was the systematic elimination of any future financial security I might have expected as their daughter. Between the stolen college fund, the medical insurance money, and now the inheritance transfer, Madison would end up with everything while I would be left with nothing but the debt I'd accumulated trying to survive their favoritism. The most insidious aspect of this whole process was how Madison positioned herself as the victim whenever I showed any reluctance to participate enthusiastically in my own financial abuse. She would tear up and ask why I couldn't just be happy for her, why I had to make everything about money, why I was being so negative during what should be the happiest time of her life. Her manipulation was so effective that even I began to question whether my anger was justified. Maybe I was being petty and jealous. Maybe this was just how families worked, with parents investing more heavily in the child they believed had greater potential for success. Maybe I should be grateful for any inclusion in Madison's special day, regardless of the financial arrangements behind it. But late at night, When the house was quiet and I could think clearly without the constant pressure of family expectations, I knew that what was happening wasn't normal or acceptable. No family should operate like this, with one child systematically exploited to fund another child's advantages. No parents should steal from one daughter to finance another daughter's dreams. The wedding planning nightmare was revealing the true nature of my family relationships, stripping away years of emotional manipulation and forced gratitude to expose the calculated cruelty underneath. And with each vendor meeting, each dress fitting, each planning session where my needs were dismissed and my resources were claimed for Madison's benefit, I felt my attachment to this family weakening and my resolve to escape growing stronger. The turning point came 3 months into wedding planning, during a particularly painful dinner at Derek's parents' house, where Madison was showing off her latest wedding details to his family. I was sitting quietly at the end of the table, invisible as usual, when Derek's best friend James arrived late from work and slipped into the seat next to me. James had been Derek's roommate in college and best man in the wedding, but I'd never really spoken to him beyond polite greetings at family gatherings. What happened next changed everything. As Madison launched into her well-rehearsed presentation about centerpiece options and menu selections, James leaned over and whispered quietly, "Does your family always treat you like furniture, or is this a special occasion?" The question was asked with such genuine concern that I almost started crying right there at the dinner table. For months, I'd been questioning my own perceptions, wondering if I was overreacting to normal family dynamics. Having someone else notice and validate what I was experiencing felt like finding water in a desert. After dinner, James asked if I wanted to take a walk outside while the families continued their wedding discussions. For the first time in months, I found myself talking to someone who actually listened without immediately jumping to Madison's defense or explaining why her needs should take priority over mine. James had been observing the family interactions for years through Derek's eyes, and he'd noticed patterns that even Derek seemed blind to. "Your sister's fiancé is my best friend, so I'm supposed to be celebrating with everyone else," James said as we walked around the neighborhood. "But watching how your family operates makes me uncomfortable. Derek's family has money, so they don't notice the financial dynamics, but I grew up working class, and I can spot exploitation when I see it. What's really going on here?" I found myself telling James everything. The stolen college fund, the medical insurance fraud, the wedding expenses that were bankrupting my parents, the inheritance manipulation, all of it. Having someone listen without judgment or immediate defensiveness was so novel that I couldn't stop talking. James asked thoughtful questions that helped me see patterns I'd missed and connections I hadn't made. The most important thing James offered was practical help. He worked in banking and understood financial documentation in ways that I didn't. When I described the paperwork I'd found in Dad's office, James immediately recognized the legal implications and offered to help me gather more comprehensive evidence. "If what you're telling me is true," he said, "your family has committed multiple federal crimes. Identity theft, insurance fraud, trust fund embezzlement. These aren't just moral failures, they're felonies." Over the following weeks, James became my secret ally and investigative partner. He helped me access online banking records using information from documents I'd photographed, and what we discovered was far worse than I'd initially understood. The financial abuse extended back much further and was much more systematic than I'd realized. The trust fund revelation was devastating. My grandfather, who had died when I was 12, had left equal inheritance funds for both Madison and me to be accessed when we turned 21. The original documents clearly stated that each granddaughter would receive $40,000, money that was intended to help us establish our adult lives. When Madison turned 21, however, she had gained access to both funds totaling $80,000. The paperwork showed that my parents had forged my signature on multiple documents, claiming that I had voluntarily transferred my inheritance to Madison because I didn't need it due to my different life goals. James helped me understand that this wasn't just favoritism or poor judgment, it was criminal fraud that could result in serious federal charges. But the discoveries kept getting worse. Madison hadn't just passively received my stolen inheritance. She had been actively using it to build a secret real estate empire. While I was struggling to afford rent on tiny apartments and eating ramen noodles for dinner, Madison had been purchasing investment properties using money that belonged to me. The property records showed 3 rental houses in Madison's name, all purchased with cash down payments that matched exactly with trust fund withdrawal amounts and medical insurance reimbursements. Madison had been presenting herself to the community as a successful young entrepreneur with a thriving property management business, when in reality she was a thief building wealth with stolen funds. Derek's family admired Madison's business acumen and financial success, never suspecting that her impressive portfolio was built on money stolen from her sick sister. The wedding wasn't just being funded by my stolen inheritance. Madison's entire adult identity as a successful, independent woman was a fraud constructed with my resources. James helped me investigate Madison's wedding planning business, which she'd started during her junior year of college. The initial investment capital, client deposits, and business equipment had all been purchased with money from my trust fund and medical insurance reimbursements. Madison was literally using my money to build a career while I worked multiple minimum wage jobs to survive. The community saw Madison as an inspiring example of young entrepreneurship and family values. She gave interviews to local magazines about balancing work and wedding planning, spoke at high school career days about following your dreams, and was featured in social media posts about successful young women making it on their own. All of it was built on a foundation of theft and deception. The most painful discovery was how extensively Derek's family had been deceived. They believed they were gaining a daughter-in-law who was financially responsible, professionally accomplished, and morally upstanding. James showed me text messages where Derek praised Madison's business skills and financial independence to his parents, completely unaware that her success story was fabricated. But perhaps the cruelest revelation was understanding how this theft had affected my credit and financial standing. Madison had used my social security number and personal information to apply for business credit cards and loans when her wedding planning company experienced cash flow problems. When those ventures failed, the debt had been attached to my credit report while Madison walked away to start new projects with fresh stolen funds. I was working multiple jobs and living paycheck to paycheck not just because my family had stolen my opportunities, but because they had actively sabotaged my financial future by attaching their failures to my credit history. Every apartment application I'd been denied, every loan I couldn't qualify for, every credit card rejection had been the result of debt that Madison had generated using my identity. James helped me pull comprehensive credit reports and financial histories that showed the full scope of the identity theft. Over the past 5 years, Madison had opened 17 different financial accounts in my name, accumulated $23,000 in debt that was affecting my credit score, and had even used my information to secure vendor contracts for her business that she later defaulted on. The wedding planning business had failed twice, leaving unpaid debts to florists, caterers, photographers, and venue operators throughout our region. All of these business failures were attached to my name and credit history, while Madison simply moved to new areas and started fresh companies under different business structures. The final piece of the puzzle was understanding my parents' plan for the family estate after Madison's wedding. James helped me access the estate planning documents that Dad kept in his home office safe, and what we found was a systematic plan to transfer all family assets to Madison while leaving me completely disinherited. The life insurance policies, property deeds, investment accounts, and retirement funds were all being restructured to name Madison as the sole beneficiary. My parents weren't just favoring one child over another. They were constructing a financial future where I would inherit nothing while Madison would receive everything, including the fruits of money that had been stolen from me over the years. As James and I documented each new discovery, the scope of the conspiracy became clear. This wasn't favoritism or poor judgment. It was a coordinated, multi-year campaign to systematically transfer all family resources from one daughter to another. Madison wasn't just the preferred child. She was the chosen heir who would inherit wealth built partially from funds stolen from the disinherited sister. But James offered me something even more valuable than evidence and documentation. He offered me a plan for justice that would expose everything at the moment of maximum impact, ensuring that the truth came to light when it could no longer be hidden or explained away. The wedding that Madison was planning with my stolen money was going to become the stage for revealing every theft, every lie, and every betrayal to the people whose opinions mattered most to her. Working with James felt like having a co-conspirator who understood both the legal implications and the emotional weight of what we were uncovering. His background in banking fraud investigation gave him insights into financial crimes that I never could have developed on my own. And his friendship with Derek provided access to information about the wedding timeline and guest list that would be crucial for timing our revelation perfectly. The first step was consulting with an attorney who specialized in financial crimes and family law. James arranged the meeting through a contact at his bank, and we presented our evidence to Amanda Rodriguez, a lawyer who had prosecuted similar cases of inheritance fraud and identity theft. Her reaction to our documentation was immediate and serious. This isn't a civil family dispute. These are federal crimes that could result in significant prison time for everyone involved. Amanda explained that Madison and my parents had committed multiple felonies including wire fraud, identity theft, mail fraud, insurance fraud, and conspiracy to commit theft of federal funds. The trust fund manipulation alone carried potential sentences of up to 20 years in federal prison, and the medical insurance fraud added additional charges that could extend those sentences even further. More importantly for my situation, Amanda confirmed that I had strong legal grounds to recover all stolen funds plus damages, interest, and legal fees. The evidence James had helped me gather was comprehensive enough to support both criminal prosecution and civil recovery, meaning I could potentially reclaim everything that had been taken from me while ensuring that the people who had stolen it faced appropriate consequences. But Amanda also warned us about the timing and strategy of pursuing justice. If you file charges now, your family will have time to hide assets, destroy evidence, and coordinate their stories, she explained. Financial criminals are often sophisticated about covering their tracks once they know they're being investigated. For maximum recovery and successful prosecution, you want to catch them off guard when they can't preparation. This advice aligned perfectly with the plan that James and I had been developing. Madison's wedding represented the culmination of years of theft and fraud, a celebration funded entirely by money stolen from me and attended by everyone whose opinion mattered to our family. It would also be the moment when Madison was most vulnerable to public exposure and least able to control the narrative or minimize the damage. We decided to wait until the wedding day to reveal everything, ensuring that the truth came out in front of Derek's family, our extended relatives, community members, and business associates who had been unknowingly supporting Madison's fraudulent success story. The impact would be immediate and irreversible, and the evidence would be presented when there was no opportunity for damage control or manipulation. James's access to Derek's family and wedding planning details made him invaluable for developing our strategy. Derek's parents were prominent business owners in the community who prized their reputation and social standing above almost everything else. They had invested significant emotional and social capital in Madison, bragging to their friends about Derek's accomplished fiancée and her successful business ventures. The revelation that Madison's entire adult identity was built on theft and fraud would be devastating to Derek's family, but it would also ensure that they became allies in seeking justice rather than obstacles to accountability. Once they understood how thoroughly they had been deceived, they would want the truth exposed just as much as we did. We spent weeks gathering additional evidence and organizing our documentation into a comprehensive presentation that would be impossible to dismiss or explain away. James helped me obtain bank records showing every fraudulent transaction, insurance documents proving the medical reimbursement theft, property records revealing Madison's real estate purchases with stolen funds, and credit reports demonstrating the identity theft that had damaged my financial standing. The most damaging evidence was a series of recorded conversations that I obtained by wearing a wire during family planning meetings. With Amanda's guidance, I legally recorded my parents and Madison admitting to various aspects of their fraud, often with casual indifference that demonstrated how little remorse they felt about stealing from me. In one particularly damning recording, Madison explained to our cousin how she had convinced our parents to let her access my trust fund because I was too irresponsible to handle money after my cancer treatment. She laughed while describing how easy it was to forge my signature and how I was too stupid and grateful to question the family's financial decisions. Another recording captured Dad explaining to Uncle Bob how the medical insurance money had been better invested in Madison's future than wasted on my recovery expenses. He described my cancer treatment as an investment opportunity that had provided unexpected funds for Madison's education and business ventures. But the most devastating recording was Mom admitting to Aunt Carol that they had always planned to disinherit me because Madison was the daughter with potential, while I was just a survivor who would never amount to much anyway. She explained that giving everything to Madison was practical financial planning because I would probably never earn enough to support myself properly. These recordings proved that the theft wasn't impulsive or accidental. It was a calculated, long-term strategy to systematically transfer resources from one daughter to another based on their assessment of our relative worth and potential. The casual cruelty and calculated nature of their planning would make it impossible for them to claim ignorance or good intentions when the truth was revealed. James also helped me develop a distribution strategy for the evidence that would maximize its impact and minimize opportunities for damage control. We planned to place copies of the documentation in multiple locations throughout the wedding reception, ensuring that key people would discover the truth simultaneously and that no one could suppress or contain the information before it spread. The letter that would trigger Madison's infamous scream was carefully crafted to include just enough shocking information to guarantee immediate attention, while directing readers to specific locations where they could find complete documentation. The timing was planned so that the discovery would happen during the reception dinner, when all guests would be present and unable to leave without appearing rude. Derek would receive his copy of the evidence during the wedding ceremony itself, hidden inside what appeared to be a congratulatory card from his groomsmen. The timing would give him the entire reception to process the information and decide how to respond, while ensuring that he couldn't confront Madison privately before the public revelation occurred. We also arranged for law enforcement to be present at the reception, ostensibly as wedding guests, but actually prepared to make arrests if the evidence warranted immediate action. James had contacted Detective Martinez through Amanda's office, and she had agreed to attend the wedding in an unofficial capacity, ready to take statements and secure evidence if criminal activity was confirmed. The plan required precise timing and coordination, but it offered the best chance of ensuring that justice was served while preventing my family from destroying evidence or fleeing prosecution. More importantly, it would reveal the truth to everyone who had been unknowingly supporting Madison's fraudulent success story, ensuring that she could never again use stolen resources to build false narratives about her accomplishments. As the wedding date approached, I felt a mixture of anticipation and dread that kept me awake most nights. Part of me still loved my family despite everything they had done, and I knew that exposing their crimes would destroy relationships that could never be repaired. But I also knew that allowing the theft and fraud to continue would be a betrayal of my own worth and dignity that I couldn't accept. James reminded me regularly that what we were planning wasn't revenge, it was justice. My family had committed serious crimes that had damaged my life and financial future, and they had shown no remorse or intention of making restitution. The law existed to protect victims of financial fraud, and I had both the right and the responsibility to use it. The final piece of our preparation was ensuring my own safety and security after the revelation. Amanda helped me open new bank accounts in my name only, secure temporary housing away from my family, and prepare for the possibility that my parents might try to retaliate financially or emotionally once their crimes were exposed. By the morning of Madison's wedding, everything was in place for the most dramatic revelation our family had ever experienced. The evidence was organized, the distribution plan was ready, and the legal framework was prepared to ensure that justice would finally be served. All that remained was waiting for the moment when Madison would discover the letter that would change everything. The morning of Madison's wedding dawned with the kind of perfect weather that she had been praying for since the day Derek proposed. Clear blue skies, gentle breeze, perfect temperature for outdoor photos. As I watched her getting ready in the bridal suite, surrounded by bridesmaids and professional hair and makeup artists, I felt like I was observing the final act of an elaborate performance that had been years in the making. Madison was radiant in her $4,500 dress, and her happiness was genuine, which made what was coming even more complicated. Despite everything she had done, part of me still remembered the little girl who used to play dress-up and plan imaginary weddings. But that little girl had grown into a woman who had systematically stolen my future without a trace of conscience, and today that truth would finally be revealed. The morning preparations went smoothly according to Madison's carefully orchestrated timeline. Photos were taken in the garden, family members arrived in their finest clothing, and the house buzzed with the kind of excited energy that surrounds major life celebrations. I played my role perfectly, helping with last-minute details and smiling for photos, all while carrying the weight of what I knew was about to unfold. James had arrived early as part of the groomsmen preparations, and we exchanged brief glances that confirmed everything was proceeding according to plan. He had already placed the first set of evidence packets in Derek's hotel room, timed so that Derek would discover them while getting dressed for the ceremony. The timing would give Derek several hours to process the information before deciding how to proceed. The ceremony itself was everything Madison had dreamed of and more. The venue looked like something from a fairy tale, with thousands of dollars worth of flowers creating an enchanted garden atmosphere. 300 guests filled white chairs arranged in perfect rows, while a string quartet provided elegant background music. Madison walked down the aisle on Dad's arm, looking absolutely stunning, while Mom cried tears of joy from the front row. I stood at the altar as maid of honor, holding Madison's bouquet and watching Derek's face during the vows. He looked pale and distracted, occasionally glancing toward the groomsmen's section where James stood. I knew Derek had found the evidence packet, and his struggle to maintain composure during the ceremony was evident to anyone who knew what to look for. The ceremony concluded with the kind of picture-perfect kiss that Madison had been practicing for months, followed by enthusiastic applause and a shower of rose petals as the couple processed down the aisle. If I hadn't known what was coming next, I would have said it was one of the most beautiful weddings I had ever attended. The reception setup had taken place during the ceremony, and James had used this time to complete the evidence distribution according to our carefully planned strategy. Packets of financial documentation were placed at specific tables where Derek's parents, our extended family members, and Madison's business associates would be seated. Each packet was disguised as a wedding program or commemorative booklet, ensuring that discovery would happen naturally during the dinner service. But the centerpiece of our revelation was the letter I had placed in Madison's bridal suite, positioned so that she would find it when she returned to touch up her makeup before the reception dinner. The letter contained just enough shocking information to guarantee her immediate reaction, while directing her to the complete evidence packages that were being distributed throughout the reception venue. The cocktail hour proceeded normally, with guests mingling, taking photos, and congratulating the happy couple. Madison was in her element, graciously accepting praise and basking in the attention that she felt she deserved. Derek remained unusually quiet, but most guests attributed his subdued demeanor to wedding day nerves rather than the earth-shattering discovery he had made about his new bride. Dinner service began at 6 o'clock, and James had timed our revelation to occur during the main course, when all guests would be seated and focused on their tables. The first sign that something was wrong came when Derek's father opened what he thought was a commemorative wedding program and instead found a detailed financial analysis showing how Madison's business empire had been built with stolen inheritance funds. Derek's mother discovered her packet moments later, and her audible gasp of shock drew attention from nearby tables. Within minutes, Similar reactions were occurring throughout the reception as guests began reading evidence of systematic fraud, identity theft, and inheritance manipulation spanning several years. But the moment everyone had been waiting for came when Madison returned from her bridal suite touch-up and found my letter on her vanity table. Through the window, we could hear her voice rising to a shriek that carried across the entire reception venue. "You're joking. This can't be real. Sophia, you're joking." The letter had been carefully crafted to include the most shocking revelations in Madison's own words, drawn from the recorded conversations where she had bragged about forging my signature and stealing my trust fund. Reading her own casual admissions of fraud, written out in black and white, had clearly been more devastating than anything I could have said about her behavior. Madison burst out of the bridal suite and ran toward the reception, her wedding dress billowing behind her as she clutched my letter in her hand. Her face was a mixture of rage, panic, and disbelief as she scanned the reception tables and realized that dozens of guests were reading evidence of her crimes. "Everyone stop reading those," she screamed, rushing from table to table and trying to snatch the evidence packets away from confused guests. "Those are lies. Sophia made it all up because she's jealous. Don't believe anything you're reading." But it was too late. Derek's parents had already read enough to understand that they had been systematically deceived about Madison's character and accomplishments. Derek's father stood up from the head table and demanded an explanation in a voice that carried throughout the reception. "Madison, are these financial records accurate? Did you steal money from your sister's medical insurance and inheritance fund?" The question hung in the air like a challenge, and Madison's response revealed the depth of her panic and desperation. Instead of denying the charges or explaining the circumstances, she immediately tried to justify her actions by attacking my character and claiming that I had never deserved the money anyway. Sophia was never going to do anything important with that money, Madison shouted, her composure completely shattered. "She's not smart like me, she doesn't have ambition, she would have just wasted it on stupid things. I built a business, I created jobs, I made something of myself. She should be grateful that her money went to something worthwhile." The admission of guilt was complete and public, witnessed by 300 guests who had come to celebrate what they thought was a joyous family occasion. Derek's face went white as he realized that his new wife had just confessed to felony theft in front of their entire wedding party. But Madison wasn't finished digging her own grave. In her panic and rage, she continued defending her actions with the kind of entitled cruelty that revealed her true character. Besides, she never would have survived without our help. We saved her life, we paid for her treatments, we supported her when she was sick. She owes us everything, and if we use some insurance money for better purposes, that's just good financial planning. Derek's mother stood up from the head table with the kind of cold dignity that comes from years of social prominence, and her words cut through Madison's hysteria like a blade. "Derek, we need to discuss this situation privately. This reception is over." She turned to address the shocked guests with formal politeness. "Ladies and gentlemen, we apologize for this disruption. There seems to be a family matter that requires immediate attention." But before anyone could leave, Detective Martinez stepped forward from her position near the back of the reception venue. James had briefed her on the evidence and timing, and Madison's public confession had provided grounds for immediate action. "Madison Carter, you're under arrest for wire fraud, identity theft, and conspiracy to commit theft of federal funds." The sight of handcuffs at a wedding reception created chaos that no amount of event planning could have anticipated. Guests pulled out phones to record the unprecedented scene, while Madison screamed protests and denials that contradicted her earlier admissions of guilt. My parents rushed forward to defend Madison, but Detective Martinez had additional warrants for their arrest based on the evidence of insurance fraud and trust fund manipulation. Within 30 minutes, what had begun as Madison's fairy tale wedding had become a crime scene with multiple arrests, shocked guests, and enough evidence of financial fraud to support federal prosecution. The three people who had spent years systematically stealing from me were now facing the legal consequences of their actions in the most public and humiliating way possible. As I watched Madison being led away in handcuffs, still wearing her $4,500 wedding dress that had been purchased with my stolen inheritance money, I felt a mixture of satisfaction and sadness that was difficult to untangle. Justice was being served, but it was also the final destruction of any possibility that our family could ever be repaired. Derek stood alone at the head table, surrounded by abandoned wedding gifts and evidence packets, looking like a man who had just discovered that his entire understanding of reality was wrong. His parents were already discussing annulment procedures with their attorney, and the wedding that was supposed to launch Madison's new life had instead ended her freedom and destroyed her reputation. The reception venue that had been decorated to celebrate love and family unity was now empty except for law enforcement officials and a few remaining guests who were too shocked to leave. Madison's fairy tale had become a nightmare, and the truth had finally been revealed to everyone who needed to know it. The aftermath of Madison's wedding day arrest moved with the swift brutality that accompanies public scandals involving prominent families. Within hours of Detective Martinez escorting Madison from her own reception in handcuffs, news of the financial fraud spread through our community like wildfire, destroying reputations and relationships that had taken years to build. Derek's family reaction was immediate and decisive. Before Madison had even been processed at the county jail, Derek's parents were meeting with their attorney to discuss annulment procedures and potential civil lawsuits to recover money their son had unknowingly contributed to covering up Madison's crimes. Derek's mother, who had spent months bragging to her social circle about her son's accomplished fiancé, was now faced with the humiliation of admitting that she had been thoroughly deceived by a calculating fraud. The annulment papers were filed within 72 hours, citing fraud and misrepresentation as grounds for voiding the marriage before it could be legally consummated. Derek's father, a prominent business owner whose reputation in the community depended on his judgment and integrity, publicly distanced himself from Madison and announced that his family would cooperate fully with federal investigators. The speed with which Derek's wealthy and influential family turned against Madison demonstrated how completely she had miscalculated the risks of her deception. She had assumed that their social standing and desire to avoid scandal would motivate them to protect her, but instead their prominence made them even more determined to distance themselves from her crimes. The federal investigation that followed revealed the full scope of Madison's financial empire built on stolen funds. Property seizures began immediately as investigators froze assets and traced the source of down payments for her 3 rental properties. The houses that Madison had presented as proof of her business acumen were revealed to be evidence of systematic theft, purchased entirely with money stolen from my trust fund and medical insurance reimbursements. Madison's wedding planning business, which had made her a local celebrity and inspiration for young entrepreneurs, collapsed overnight as clients canceled contracts and vendors demanded immediate payment for outstanding debts. The revelation that her startup capital had come from identity theft and insurance fraud destroyed any credibility she had built in the business community. But the most devastating blow to Madison's public image came from the media coverage of her crimes. Local news stations picked up the story of the wedding day arrest, and the combination of financial fraud and family betrayal proved irresistible to reporters looking for dramatic human interest content. Madison's mugshot, taken while she was still wearing her wedding dress, became a symbol of entitled privilege brought low by criminal behavior. The story had all the elements that modern media coverage thrives on. A beautiful bride, a fairy tale wedding, a shocking family secret, and a dramatic public revelation. Madison found herself featured on crime podcasts, legal analysis shows, and social media discussions about family dysfunction and financial abuse. The business success story she had carefully crafted became a cautionary tale about fraud and deception. Our extended family, who had spent years enabling Madison's behavior and dismissing my concerns, were forced to confront their own complicity in the financial abuse. Aunt Carol, who had lectured me about being grateful and supportive, now faced questions about whether she had known about the trust fund theft and chosen to ignore it. Uncle Bob, who had suggested I take on debt to fund Madison's bachelorette party, was forced to admit that he had prioritized keeping peace over questioning obvious financial inconsistencies. The community reaction was particularly harsh because Madison had positioned herself as a role model for young women starting their own businesses. She had given interviews about overcoming challenges and building success through hard work and family support, never mentioning that her family support consisted of systematic theft from her cancer-surviving sister. The high school where Madison had spoken at career days quickly distanced themselves from her previous presentations, while the local Chamber of Commerce revoked her membership and removed her from their Young Entrepreneurs Council. Organizations that had featured her as an example of local business success were now dealing with the embarrassment of having promoted someone who was later revealed to be a criminal. The financial investigation led by federal prosecutors revealed additional crimes that even I hadn't suspected. The IRS opened an audit of Madison's business and personal taxes, discovering years of unreported income from rental properties and wedding planning services. The tax evasion charges added potential penalties that could extend her prison sentence significantly beyond the original fraud convictions. Madison's identity theft had been more extensive than we initially realized. Credit monitoring services revealed that she had used my personal information to open 17 different financial accounts over 5 years, including business lines of credit, equipment financing, and multiple credit cards. The damage to my credit score had been systematic and deliberate, designed to ensure that I remained financially dependent while she built wealth with stolen resources. The insurance fraud investigation expanded to include my parents' role in systematically filing false claims and hiding reimbursement payments. The insurance company's fraud department had been monitoring suspicious patterns in our family's claims for months, and Madison's arrest provided the catalyst they needed to file federal charges against Mom and Dad for conspiracy to commit insurance fraud. My parents' arrests, which occurred at their home while they were still trying to process Madison's situation, added another layer of humiliation to the family scandal. Neighbors watched as law enforcement officials searched their house and seized financial records, while local media covered their perp walk with the same intensity they had devoted to Madison's wedding day arrest. The seizure of my parents' assets revealed the full scope of their financial irresponsibility. The house that they had refinanced to fund Madison's wedding was now subject to federal asset forfeiture proceedings, since the wedding expenses had been paid with funds obtained through fraud. They faced the loss of their home, their retirement savings, and their social standing in the community. Madison's time in federal detention while awaiting trial was particularly difficult because her cellmates and guards had all seen the media coverage of her crimes. Being known as the wedding dress criminal who stole from her sick sister made her a target for both official punishment and unofficial justice from other inmates who had their own experiences with family betrayal. The letters Madison sent me from jail revealed her complete inability to accept responsibility for her actions or acknowledge the harm she had caused. Instead of apologizing or expressing remorse, she continued to blame me for ruining her life by reporting crimes that she insisted were just family financial planning. Her lack of genuine remorse likely contributed to the harsh sentence recommendation that prosecutors ultimately submitted to the federal judge. Derek's complete disappearance from Madison's life after the annulment was finalized demonstrated how thoroughly she had burned that bridge. He moved to a different state, changed his contact information, and refused all interview requests from media outlets covering the story. The man who had been planning to build a life with Madison wanted nothing more than to erase any connection to her or her crimes. The business community's reaction to Madison's fraud was swift and comprehensive. Vendors who had worked with her wedding planning company discovered that many of their outstanding invoices would never be paid, since her business assets were frozen pending restitution proceedings. The networking relationships she had cultivated were permanently destroyed, and her name became synonymous with financial deception in professional circles. But perhaps the most telling aspect of the consequences was how quickly Madison's former friends and supporters distanced themselves from her once the truth was revealed. The sorority sisters who had celebrated her success stopped visiting her in jail. The business mentors who had praised her entrepreneurship publicly condemned her crimes. And the extended family members who had enabled her behavior suddenly claimed they had always suspected something wasn't right. The federal prosecution moved forward with unusual speed, partly because Madison's public confession at her wedding reception had eliminated any need for extensive investigation or plea negotiations. The evidence of her crimes was overwhelming, her guilt was undisputed, and her lack of remorse made her an unsympathetic defendant who prosecutors could use to send a message about the consequences of family financial abuse. As I watched the systematic destruction of Madison's carefully constructed life, I felt a mixture of vindication and sadness that was difficult to process. Justice was being served, but it was also the final proof that the family I had grown up believing in had never actually existed. The love and support I thought I remembered were revealed to be conditional privileges that could be withdrawn whenever my needs conflicted with Madison's desires. The consequences were unfolding exactly as Amanda had predicted, with Madison facing federal prison time, my parents losing their home and retirement security, and the family name becoming permanently associated with fraud and betrayal. But the most important consequence was that I was finally free from the psychological manipulation and financial abuse that had defined my entire adult life. 6 months after Madison's sentencing to 5 years in federal prison, I stood in the living room of my new apartment, surrounded by furniture that I had purchased with money from the restitution settlement, and marveled at how completely my life had changed. The apartment was small but comfortable, furnished with pieces I had chosen because I liked them rather than because they were all I could afford. For the first time in my adult life, I was living without the constant anxiety about money that had shadowed every decision since college. The legal victory had been more comprehensive than even Amanda had initially predicted. The federal court had ordered full restitution of all stolen funds, plus interest and penalties that brought the total recovery to nearly $200,000. Madison's seized properties had been sold to satisfy the judgment, and my parents' assets had been liquidated to cover their portion of the theft and fraud charges. But the money, while important for my practical security, was less significant than the psychological transformation that had occurred through months of therapy and self-reflection. Working with Dr. Sarah Chen, a therapist who specialized in family trauma and financial abuse, I had begun to untangle years of conditioning that had taught me to accept exploitation as normal family dynamics. The therapy process had been more difficult than I anticipated because it required examining not just Madison's crimes, but my own role in enabling them through years of compliance and silence. Dr. Chen helped me understand that my desire to maintain family relationships had been exploited by people who were willing to use my love against me, and that my loyalty had been systematically weaponized to facilitate continued abuse. Learning to recognize gaslighting, emotional manipulation, and financial abuse as forms of domestic violence had been particularly challenging because it required accepting that my parents had deliberately harmed me rather than simply favoring Madison. The therapeutic work of grieving the family I thought I had while accepting the reality of the family I actually had was ongoing and often painful. But the healing process had also brought unexpected gifts, including genuine friendships with people who valued me for who I was rather than what I could provide for them. James had become not just an ally in seeking justice, but a partner in building the kind of relationship I had never thought possible. His consistent support during the legal proceedings had evolved into something deeper, based on mutual respect and shared values rather than manipulation and exploitation. The most meaningful aspect of my new life was the nonprofit organization I had established using a portion of the restitution funds. The Sophia Carter Foundation provided legal and financial assistance to victims of family financial abuse, helping them navigate the complex process of recovering stolen assets and escaping toxic family dynamics. Working with other survivors had shown me how common my experience actually was and how few resources existed to help people who were being systematically exploited by their own relatives. The foundation had already assisted dozens of clients in documenting financial crimes, connecting with appropriate legal representation, and rebuilding their lives after escaping abusive family situations. The foundation work had also become a way of transforming my painful experience into something that could benefit others facing similar circumstances. Speaking at conferences about family financial abuse, consulting with attorneys who represented fraud victims, and providing support services to people who were questioning their own family dynamics felt like the most important work I had ever done. Madison's letters from prison continued to arrive periodically, but they no longer had the power to manipulate my emotions or make me question my decisions. Her attempts to maintain control through guilt, blame, and false promises of family reconciliation were transparent now that I understood the psychological tactics she had always used to exploit my desire for acceptance. The latest letter had included a request for money for commissary items and phone calls, along with promises that she had learned her lesson and wanted to rebuild our sisterly relationship once she was released. The irony of Madison asking me for financial support while serving time for stealing my money was not lost on me, and I had returned the letter unopened with a note explaining that all communication should go through my attorney. My parents had made similar attempts at reconciliation, reaching out through relatives and family friends to suggest that we could work things out as a family and move past the unpleasantness of the criminal proceedings. They seemed to believe that their financial ruin and social humiliation were punishment enough, and that I should be ready to forgive and rebuild relationships as if nothing significant had happened. But the therapy process had taught me that forgiveness was not the same as reconciliation, and that I could release my anger without opening myself up to continued exploitation. My parents had shown no genuine remorse for their actions, no understanding of the harm they had caused, and no commitment to changing the attitudes and behaviors that had enabled years of abuse. The community response to my story had been overwhelmingly supportive once the truth about Madison's crimes became widely known. People who had previously dismissed me as jealous or ungrateful now approached me with apologies and expressions of admiration for my courage in exposing the fraud. The local business community had invited me to speak about recognizing and preventing financial abuse, and several organizations had asked me to join their boards or advisory committees. But the most meaningful support had come from other family scapegoats who recognized their own experiences in my story. The emails and messages from people who had been systematically devalued, exploited, or disinherited by their own families created a sense of community that helped heal the isolation I had experienced for years. Working with these survivors had taught me that family dysfunction often follows predictable patterns, with one child designated as the golden child who can do no wrong while another becomes the scapegoat who bears responsibility for all family problems. Understanding these dynamics as systemic rather than personal had been crucial for rebuilding my sense of self-worth. The Foundation's research into family financial abuse had revealed that these crimes were far more common than most people realized, but severely underreported because victims were reluctant to pursue legal action against their own relatives. Many people endured decades of exploitation because they couldn't imagine that their family members would deliberately steal from them or that legal remedies were available. 1 year after Madison's sentencing, I received notice that she was requesting early release for good behavior and completion of prison education programs. The prospect of her eventual return to society didn't frighten me the way it might have before therapy and healing, because I now understood that her power over me had been based on my own willingness to accept exploitation in exchange for family acceptance. James and I had begun discussing marriage and building a family of our own, based on principles of mutual respect, financial transparency, and emotional support that were completely foreign to my experience growing up. The idea of creating healthy family dynamics seemed both exciting and terrifying, but Dr. Chen assured me that recognizing dysfunction was the first step toward avoiding it. The process of healing from family trauma had taught me that love was not supposed to hurt, that support was not supposed to come with conditions, and that family members were not supposed to exploit each other's vulnerabilities for personal gain. These lessons seemed obvious in retrospect, but they had been revolutionary for someone raised to believe that accepting mistreatment was a form of loyalty. As I prepared for Madison's eventual release and the possibility of renewed attempts at manipulation, I felt confident in my ability to maintain the boundaries I had established. The scared, guilty, desperate woman who had accepted years of financial abuse in hopes of earning family approval no longer existed. In her place was someone who understood her own worth and refused to accept less than she deserved. The letter I had left on Madison's pillow had indeed made her scream, "You're joking," but it had accomplished something much more important than just shocking her with revelations about consequences she never thought she would face. It had been my declaration of independence from a family system that had never valued me, and my first step toward building a life based on truth, justice, and genuine love. Looking back at the journey from victim to survivor to advocate, I realized that the most important lesson wasn't about recovering stolen money or seeing criminals punished. It was about learning that some relationships are too toxic to maintain, regardless of biological connections, and that sometimes walking away from family is the strongest and healthiest choice you can make. If you've recognized your own family dynamics in this story, please know that you're not alone and that help is available. Financial abuse is a serious crime whether it happens between strangers or relatives, and you deserve legal protection and emotional support regardless of what your family members tell you. I'd love to hear your thoughts and experiences in the comments below. Have you ever dealt with family financial abuse or favoritism? How did you handle it? Please hit that like button if this story resonated with you. Subscribe for more real-life stories about overcoming family dysfunction, and share this video with anyone who might need to hear that they deserve better treatment from the people who claim to love them. Thank you for taking this journey with me, and remember that your worth is not determined by how your family treats you. You deserve respect, honesty, and genuine love, and sometimes the family you choose is better than the family you're born into. Take care of yourselves, and I'll see you in the next video.